Tonight on Frontline, Cuba and cocaine.
With funding provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is Frontline.
Five, 1 mile.
Roger that.
Yeah, I don't think that's the target, though.
No, that's him. I get a visual.
Off the coast of Florida, U.S. Customs practiced tracking a suspect plane.
I'm taking the radar to standby.
Small aircraft like this are the workhorses of the Colombian cocaine trade.
Yeah, minus 146, I believe.
The customs plane sneaks in behind the bandit's tail, where he can't be seen, and waits for him to make the drop. This is the story of how for 10 years, part of this narcotics traffic has passed through Cuba. Since the triumph of his revolution over 30 years ago, Fidel Castro has laid claim to a higher morality. Castro says drugs, like gambling and prostitution, have been stamped out in Cuba. But abroad, it now appears that Castro may have allowed drugs to be used as a weapon in his war against Yankee imperialism.
WCMQ-FM Hialeah, Miami, and WZMQ-FM Key Largo.
Esta es FM 92.
Little Havana, Miami. Hard evidence that Cuba was involved in the drug trade came to light here. In 1987, agents of the Drug Enforcement Agency were staking out this corner. Two gangs were under surveillance. The Ceballoses from Colombia, and a family of Cuban Americans called Ruiz.
The connections with the swipe here.
Unbeknownst to either the Ceballos or the Ruiz organization, individuals had infiltrated both of those organizations, and by taping their phone conversations, wearing body wires, and also setting up a video surveillance operation, they were able to get the Ruizes and the Ceballoses discussing their operation through Cuba.
There's a runway in Colombia, but the same runway in Cuba? Yeah. The Cubans?
Yeah. Listen, we're going on Wednesday.
The difference in the Ruiz and the Ceballos case from what you commonly see as far as narcotics trafficking was the ability to transship through Cuba, which would be the most ideal place for a narcotics trafficker to operate in.
The man who set up the deal that made transshipments through Cuba possible was Arnaldo Ruiz. He could do this because he had connections inside the Cuban government.
Castro couldn't let something like that leak out.
Yeah.
Because then they're going to really come down on Cuba.
Anyway, he was going to be the smuggler, you know what I mean?
Think about it.
I thought you got to have connections.
Arnaldo Ruiz had relatives and connections in the Cuban government to guarantee the security of the shipments when they moved through Cuba. So they worked with Arnaldo Ruiz to move several of their shipments through the island of Cuba.
Until he died of a heart attack on New Year's Eve, Arnaldo Ruiz had been serving a 17-year prison sentence for drug trafficking. He thought the sentence too harsh. To get it reduced, he'd offered U.S. authorities information on 5 other drug smugglers who, like him, had Cuban connections.
Every time that I went over there, I was completely sure that I was 100% backing all the way to the top. Otherwise, I never ever touch a thing down there. When you go and to a place, an office, and everything is resolved, everything is taken care of, and people play with cocaine like it was mangoes and oranges or whatever, you know, I mean, you know that everything is controlled.
Everything may have been under control in Cuba, but in Miami, a camera was recording as Arnaldo Ruiz and his son Ruben plotted how to refuel a drug plane in Cuba.
Well, let me tell you something. How about if I get permission to refuel down there in Cuba?
Son of a bitch, I was going to ask you that right now.
Yes.
That would be the best.
This would be best.
That would be the best.
This would be best. This would be best.
This is how Arnaldo set up the drug run. First, a boat crossed the Florida Straits. It made landfall on the Cuban coast at a port called Varadero, not far from this lighthouse. Apparently, everything had been arranged in advance. Ruiz says he was expected by a Cuban Coast Guard colonel.
Colonel who?
Pardon?
And who was he?
The chief of command of the naval operations in Varadero.
And he knew about your operation?
He was informed that I was going to arrive, yes.
Behind the main harbor at Varadero is a secluded creek. The expensive pleasure boats moored here include the high-speed cigarette boats beloved of drug smugglers. A small detachment of the Cuban Coast Guard keeps permanent watch over these craft.
Did the Coast Guard help you when you arrived at Cuba?
Yes.
How? What did they do?
Well, they received me, put the boat in a place, in a safe place, you know, so it cannot be found, take me to shore, and make me contact with Padrón or Miguel or Eduardo if he was there at that time.
Meanwhile, Arnaldo's son, Ruben, was to collect the cocaine in Colombia and fly it to Cuba. His Cuban contacts had given him a special call sign to use as he approached Cuban airspace.
Yes, he used to have a number, and that number authorized him to landing.
And how would he use a number? What exactly did he do?
Well, the Cuban will ask for, you know, this is AQ7 Santa Clara or whatever. Okay, this is UPI 102. Okay, UPI 102, keep going. That's it, no problem.
Ruiz says a Cuban Air Force colonel had cleared Ruben to fly through military airspace.
He told him to fly all the way over the land. My son told him, well, I am crossing all the western part of Cuba. It doesn't matter, don't worry about it. Nobody will hurt you. The airport is at your service tomorrow.
On the surveillance tapes, Ruben is heard bragging about the help he got from the Cuban Air Force.
Let me tell you something. This is something I'm not lying to you. I've flown to places in Cuba that nobody does. I'm talking military runways. I'm talking camouflage MiG-20s, MiG-23s, okay?
Ruiz says when Ruben landed at Varadero, it was all out in the open. For the airport officials, it seems this was routine.
Well, the plane landed and they just moved it to one wing of the airport. Unloaded. They didn't pretend nothing. They didn't pretend nothing to the authorities. They fill up the gasoline. They went over there to the cabin that we rented. Enjoy, have a bath, have a nice meal, rest. Next following morning, boom, 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 and that's it.
Like other drug smugglers, Ruben was given the red carpet treatment.
And you sit on a table about half the size of this, your office here, where you've got big pork legs this big, and you got big steaks this big, and you've got big things this big of rice for about 7 or 8 guys, okay? Nobody eats that way over there.
While Ruben was enjoying lunch, Ruiz says armed Cuban personnel were unloading the drugs.
How did they get the drugs from the airport to the seaport?
To the airport, to the seaport, they used to have a van that they use in the transportation of those things.
Who provided the van?
The department, of course.
The Department of Ministry of Interior?
Yeah. They put the merchandise on board and that was it.
Once the drugs were on board, Ruiz says a Cuban Coast Guard cutter escorted their boat out to sea, and after scanning the Gulf with its radar, gave the all clear.
You believe me when I tell you something? You know the big military Coast Guard boats? The ones that are equipped with all the radars and everything? It's got that. And they scan the whole area out, man. And they tell you, go this way, go that way, yeah.
Cuba had been linked to drug smuggling before, but had always dismissed the accusations as American propaganda. But after the U.S. Coast Guard seized one of his boats in 1988, Ruiz was arrested. It was now impossible for Cuba to brush aside the evidence of the surveillance tapes and the political implications of what was said on them.
He says the money from this last trip that was paid is in Fidel's drawer. Fidel Castro, damn it. Don't you know who Fidel is?
In Havana, the government had to be seen to act. Ruiz's co-conspirators were rounded up, and Cuba mounted the biggest state trial in 30 years. The entire trial was videotaped, and after a 2-day delay for editing, was broadcast nightly on Cuban TV. It is often referred to as the Ochoa trial, because the most prominent defendant was Cuba's most successful general, Arnaldo Ochoa. Ochoa's court-martial and the subsequent trial certainly gave the appearance that Cuba was cracking down on drugs. 10 of the accused were jailed for up to 30 years. Ochoa and 3 others faced the firing squad. The state prosecutor was Juan Escalona.
Despite all our efforts, this was the first time we were able to detect any evidence that Cuban personalities or Cuban authorities were linked to drug trafficking. It's something we'd been accused of for many years. However, we are convinced it was part of a campaign of disinformation meant to discredit the Cuban Revolution.
Acusado Arnaldo Ochoa Sánchez, ubíquese frente al tribunal.
After the court-martial had stripped Ochoa of his medals and rank, the main trial began.
Ochoa Sánchez.
But the conduct of the trial raises many questions. For example, why was Ochoa sentenced to death when there was no evidence he smuggled drugs, only that he conspired to attempt it? Why did his 13 fellow defendants all waive their right to proper legal representation, make tearful confessions, and beg the court for the maximum sentence? Why were foreign observers banned by the court?
The show trials in Havana lumped 2 people together, Tony de la Guardia and Arnaldo Ochoa. In fact, Arnaldo Ochoa, who was a hero of the revolution, a hero of Cuba, a 3-star general, a genuine military hero, had no involvement in drugs.
Antonio de la Guardia Fon, ubíquese frente al tribunal.
The trial was really about Tony de la Guardia and his involvement in drugs. No question he was, he admitted it. He only thought that he had been given orders from Fidel to do exactly that.
Colonel Tony de la Guardia had been a high-flying intelligence officer. The question that goes to the heart of the trial was whether he and his co-defendants had smuggled drugs as a form of covert action, or, as the state prosecutor alleged, were simply corrupt officials. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when one of the accused, Miguel Ruiz Pu, testified. Miguel, a distant cousin of the drug smuggler Reinaldo Ruiz, had been the government official who had made Reinaldo's Cuban connection possible. The court heard Miguel claim that Cuba's cocaine connection was approved at the top. If true, this could have diminished his culpability. But none of the military officers who were supposed to represent the accused made any attempt to develop this line of defense.
Acusado, usted era capitán del Ministerio del Interior, ¿no?
Así es.
Under cross-examination, Miguel Ruiz would become almost incoherent with fear.
Porque todo lo que yo hago, mi jefe lo discute a máximo nivel. Dijo Martínez, textualmente. A Eduardo, comentarme. Chico, yo tengo la impresión que esto está a máximo nivel. ¿Y que esto está a máximo nivel? Secretario, que lo veo.
¿Le pide unos minutos para que el médico lo examine?
Sí, ya lo mandé a buscar.
Tira fuerte por la boca.
At this point, the court adjourned while Ruiz received medical attention. Later witnesses contradicted his story, and the prosecution asserted that the conspiracy was limited to Tony de la Guardia and his ring.
The only time we had any evidence that enabled us to detect this problem was last year, and not before, because the previous accusations were ridiculous. They've also accused Fidel Castro of being the ringleader of drug trafficking in Cuba, when Fidel Castro is our leader, our director, our guide.
Since the trial, Castro has insisted that Tony de la Guardia was the beginning and end of Cuba's involvement in drugs. What began in late 1986, he says, was eliminated in 1989. When it comes to narcotics trafficking, Cuba is clean.
Como podrán observar, difícilmente existe en el mundo un país menos atractivo que el nuestro para el narcotráfico internacional. Aprovecho la ocasión para reiterar la total disposición de Cuba a colaborar en cuanto esfuerzo serio y coherente se emprende en la lucha contra el narcotráfico.
Scramble the citation, scramble the citation.
But here in South Florida, the drug-busting pilots and investigators of U.S. Customs believe that Cuba's involvement with drugs goes way back.
There was certainly indications of Cuban involvement way before 1987. Going back into the early 80s, there were cases involving Cubans involved in drug trafficking into the U.S.
Target at 75, Homestead 120, 10-4.
For Cuba, geography is destiny. The drug planes from Colombia must cross the Caribbean to reach Florida. The most direct route to the U.S. is over Cuba. This shortcut meant that small planes could fill up with drugs and not waste valuable space on extra fuel. In the early 80s, U.S. patrol planes with their infrared cameras were tracking drug planes bound for the Bahamas.
2,700 feet in front of us, 8 knots closure, feet wet. I got a boat, go fast in the water.
They began to notice how some planes, like this one, would duck into Cuban airspace on their way to the drop.
Feet dry.
The traffic grew.
3,000 feet in front of us, 13 knots closure. He's right on the nose. Drop, 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 drop.
Suspicion hardened into certainty.
Still dropping, still dropping.
I believe, based on just experience and what I've seen, that it is very difficult to assume that the Cubans don't know what's going on. It's just very, very difficult because flight after flight after flight, overflying, dropping, airdrop after airdrop after airdrop inside the Cuban territorial waters.
In Washington, a Senate subcommittee on narcotics traffic was hearing the same story.
Were you also involved in the transshipment of narcotics through Cuba?
Yes.
And what period of time did you transship narcotics through Cuba?
Desde 1980-81 hasta...
Since 1980-81 until 1985-86.
The chief investigator for the Senate committee was Jack Blum.
Well, the way this turned up was we interviewed large numbers of people who were drug smugglers. And these guys would be telling us about various things they'd done all over Central America. Panama, dealing in Costa Rica, dealings with the Contras. And a number of them, without us prompting or asking, would then say, and by the way, would you like to hear about our arrangements with Cuba? And of course, we did like to hear about those arrangements.
Blum's star witness was a former aide to Panama's General Noriega. Jose Blandon attended meetings in Cuba with Fidel Castro and brought photographs to prove it.
Were copied from originals.
Blandon claims that the Cubans were involved in drug trafficking and that Castro's motives were political.
Fidel Castro's theory with regard to this aspect is that Colombia's political world, that if you want to have an influence on Colombia's political world, you have to have an influence on the drug trafficking world too.
Blandon accused Cuba of running drugs through Nicaragua and Panama as well as Colombia.
In the case of Colombia, there is a link between drug trafficking and the guerrilla movement. And part of the coordination movement is done by the Latin American Department of the Communist Party of Cuba.
Cuba's America Department is not part of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, but a separate entity under the direct control of Fidel Castro. Dr. Rachel Ehrenfeld of New York University is an acknowledged expert on the Cuban government's involvement with narcotics and the part played by its Department of America.
In 1974, the Department of the America was created, and Manuel Pinheiro Lozada was heading it. Manuel Pinheiro Lozada is a good friend of Fidel Castro. They go back to the revolution. He's very trusted by Fidel, therefore he was assigned to head this new department. This department is responsible for the implementation of the covert Cuban foreign policy objectives.
The department's main objective was to foment revolution. This brought it to the attention of the White House and the National Security Council, where in the early 80s, Roger Fontaine was a Latin American analyst.
It really does the priority missions that Fidel has set out. And since 1974, those priority missions have been in Central America, Northern South America, destabilize, hopefully overthrow the governments in the region.
In the mid-70s, Castro saw Colombia as ripe for revolution, and the Department of America sent one of its top agents to Bogota. His name was Fernando Ravelo Renedo, and in 1975, he was Cuba's ambassador to Colombia.
He was a facilitator, a man who knew how to use cutouts, knew how to use false documents, how to use clandestine airstrips, and all the rest.
Quite the ambassador.
An operator. I mean, a man who is, yes, an ambassador, used the diplomatic as a front, as a shield, but as a very well-trained officer, a very experienced officer in clandestine secret operations.
Colombia's M-19 guerrillas got their weapons and training from Cuba. Ravelo apparently encouraged them to use narcotics to finance their revolution and promised them help.
That the Cubans will help them to transfer drugs to the United States. They will provide them with safe haven, with fuels, with radar, and everything else. And in return, the same boats will bring arms to the insurgencies, the communist insurgencies that the Cubans were supporting in Latin America, in this case, specifically the M-19 in Colombia.
Ravelo was the link between the guerrillas and the traffickers. One night in 1979, the ambassador attended a rather wild party in a penthouse at the Bogota Hilton. The man who'd laid on the champagne, the caviar, and the girls was a Colombian lawyer called Johnny Crump. Today, Crump lives in hiding in the USA. Back then, he was one of Colombia's more successful drug smugglers. A number of other traffickers attended the party, among them Crump's partner, Jaime Guillo Lara. Together, Crump and Lara approached Ravelo and teased him about what a perfect place Cuba would be for refueling drug planes.
You know that Jaime asked the question like a joke, but at the same time was some kind of a way to open the conversation.
And how did Ravelo respond when Jaime made his little joke?
Like a joke too, but opening the door, said, yeah, this is a good idea, why wouldn't talk about?
He didn't leave the party?
No, he stayed in the party.
A few days later, Crump met Ravelo again. The ambassador had his deputy with him, another agent of the America Department called Gonzalo Basols. This photograph shows the three of them together, and this time, according to Crump, the talk was strictly business.
We make an arrangement with Fernando Ravelo to send a boat loaded with drugs to Cuban waters. And the boat was supposed to stay in Cuban waters for whatever need, 1 week, 3, 4, 5 days, till the moment that Jaime had time to send speedboat from Miami to pick the merchandise in his boat and send it back the speedboat to Miami.
And how would the Cubans help this boat?
He will clear, not only clear, the Coast Guard will give protection to the boat.
The Coast Guard would give protection?
To the boat, right.
Johnny Crump and Ambassador Ravelo met again in Panama. Crump says they flew on to Havana to finalize arrangements for the drug shipment.
We took the plane from Panama to Havana, and when we landed in Havana, I never go through customs to anything. They never checked my passport. I just went from the plane to a Cuban government car that was waiting for us in the airport. I mean, it's no way that you can go to any country with no passport, with nothing like that, landing from another country in an international airport and have a car waiting for you right there in the field. It has to be with the okay of that government, that country.
In Cuba, Crump says he stayed at the Havana Libre, where for him, everything was free.
Everything was paid by the Cuban government. The hotel, you had to sign like you are a guest from the Cuban government because they don't let me pay for the hotel.
Every day, a government car would drive Crump to a series of official engagements. Crump says the most important man he met was René Rodriguez Cruz, a member of Cuba's Central Committee and a friend of Fidel Castro.
That gave me more confidence and trust that all the Cuban government was approving the operation.
The Cubans were generous hosts. Crump was wined and dined at government expense. He kept waiting for someone to ask for a bribe, but they never did.
Nobody was asking for money. Everything was to build some kind of a relationship, not to get money for one person in particular.
You weren't paying bribes?
Right. I never paid any money to anybody in Cuba, and they never asked me for nothing.
But there were problems. The drug boat was delayed. A nervous Crump sought reassurance.
Fernando Ravelo told me that don't worry, that north side of Cuba was clear for the boat to stay there and unload the drugs and everything. And Fernando told me that 3 or 4 times that everything was okay, that he already cleared everything over there with the Cuban Navy and Coast Guard.
When Crump's boat did come in, it was met by a Navy ship with a Cuban admiral on board. Aldo Santamaria's name would become well known to former U.S. Attorney Dick Gregory.
It was essentially his Navy ships which were protecting the dope ship that was coming through Cuba. Without his cooperation, of course, this safe haven for the drug boats wasn't possible.
Dick Gregory was the prosecutor when Johnny Crump was finally arrested and tried in this Miami courthouse. At the trial, Gregory indicted no less than 4 high Cuban officials for drug trafficking.
We charged Santa Maria Cuadrado, the Vice Admiral of the Cuban Navy, René Rodriguez Cruz, who was a high-level communist minister, Ravelo Renedo, who was the Cuban ambassador to Colombia, and we charged a man named Basols, who was Ravelo Renedo's assistant.
In Havana, they dismissed the whole affair as U.S. propaganda. Ravelo Renedo and Basols were appointed ambassadors to Nicaragua and Panama, and Admiral Santamaria's role has never been investigated.
In this case, there was no need to investigate the Cuban naval commander, because the honor of Admiral Aldo Santamaria is beyond question. Besides, the whole thing is a complete impossibility. It would have involved ships and sailors from the Navy, and that's something we would have known about immediately.
The Cuban government, to my knowledge, did nothing that changed the course of trafficking by the drug traffickers coming out of South America. For the most part, planes and boats were still ducking into Cuban air and sea space to protect their shipments and to avoid U.S. interdiction.
By 1978, another government department was becoming involved with narcotics. This is the Ministry of the Interior, headquarters of Cuban intelligence. One of its top operatives was Colonel Tony de la Guardia. According to one historian who's made a special study of Cuba's drug scandal, de la Guardia was a close friend of Fidel Castro.
If he ever loved the company of a person or of a type of person, Tony La Guardia was that type. Like a favorite son. Someone who could come into the room, Fidel would be talking to someone else, and Tony would just barge in, walk straight to the kitchen, open the fridge,
pour himself a glass of milk, come, sit in the sofa, drink his milk, observe what was going on, and then lean on the sofa and fall asleep. The most comparable standard we have is possibly the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Oliver North.
Castro's Oliver North could be found in a heavily guarded street just behind the Soviet embassy compound. Tony de la Guardia handled special operations and had his own department.
It used to be called the Z department within Minint. Then it was changed at some time for some reason to MC, but it was run by Tony de la Guardia, and they were tasked to, in imaginative and often illegal ways, to raise badly needed hard currency for Cuba and the Castro regime.
Tony de la Guardia ran many of his operations through Panama. To circumvent the U.S. trade embargo, Cuba was shipping essential goods through Panama. Tony de la Guardia decided to use this trade route for more exotic purposes. A former intelligence officer, now in exile, Manuel de Beunza, was familiar with Department MC's operations.
The function of this department was to create private companies in different parts of the world that officially didn't belong to Cuba, but actually were totally Cuban. Through these companies, they broke the blockade. They were involved in illegal businesses like false passports, drug deals, arms sales, etc.
Tony de la Guardia used Panama's relaxed business laws to establish scores of paper companies. These disguised the highly lucrative state-approved smuggling operation which was being mounted by Department MC.
This group was created and operated over a number of years to obtain certain spare parts, accessories, components, and computer systems that enabled us to make progress in certain areas of our development. Much of this equipment came on speedboats from the United States to Cuba.
James Herring was one of those who skippered high-speed boats across the Florida Straits. Though he says he never smuggled drugs, his business literature left no doubt that he was an adventurer. On one of his trips, he took these snapshots. This is his boat. This is one of his crew. This is some of the high-tech goods he was running into Cuba. And this is the Cuban launch, which met him outside Veradero.
When I would go into Veradero with boatloads of equipment, we would be received by marked vessels that the Cuban Navy, so to speak, utilized, their military gunboats. They would escort us into the gunboat dockage there at Veradero. From there, they would offload. We would stay as long as we felt necessary, refuel us, wine and dine us, and when we were ready to return to the Keys, they would take and escort us out.
Herring started running fast boats in and out of Cuba in 1982. He soon noticed that DGI intelligence agents were handling narcotics, and this was apparently standard operating procedure.
On occasions, they would even offer drugs in lieu of the cash. The DGI had the availability of enormous amounts of drugs that they had warehoused through seizures that they had made in their country on drug operations that weren't paying protection for their airspace or their waterways. So they had a readily available amount of drugs in the form of cocaine, quaaludes, and marijuana. I was even offered at one point in time as much as 1 kilo for any $1,000 worth of services. A kilo being worth $25,000 wholesale, that would have been a tremendous incentive to take the drugs above the cash.
By the early 1980s, the cocaine being flown across the Caribbean was worth billions. Colombian smugglers bought whole islands, like Norman's Key in the Bahamas. This was one of their landing strips. But Cuba could offer certain advantages, not least of them more reliable landing facilities. And that's how Cuba began to cash in on the drug trade.
They were paid for their services. They provided safe haven, they provided passports, they provided fuel, they provided radar services and escorts of boats, and for that they were paid. In addition, they were taking commission from each shipment of drugs that went through Cuba.
Cuba allowed several major drug smugglers to hide out on the island. In 1982, one of them set up home here at the Marina Hemingway. Though Robert Vesco was indicted in 1989 for smuggling over a ton of cocaine through Cuba, he's still living there. James Herring once worked for Vesco.
Robert Vesco was treated like royalty in Cuba. He was put up in a very nice home there in the Marina area, had a place for his boat out back. He had all the luxuries of home.
I've seen Robert Vesco in house number 4, which was given to him by Fidel, and I've seen him on Fidel Castro's own yacht, the Yarama. They were fishing together.
You saw him on Fidel's yacht?
Yes, I have seen him personally.
Basically, Vesco was Fidel Castro's procurer. He was paying his dues to the Cuban government for his asylum there. And in doing so, he was willing to procure anything that they needed, get involved in any type of operation that needed to be.
There's no question that when Vesco was living in Cuba, he was engaging in narcotics trafficking, that there were drugs coming to Vesco, and that he was then transshipping those drugs to the United States.
Vesco arranged for one of his business associates to visit Cuba. This is Carlos Lader, a founding member of the Medellin cartel. Today, he's in a U.S. penitentiary serving a sentence of life plus 135 years. Because his case is under appeal, Lader declined to discuss any drug business he may have done in Cuba. But he does confirm that he went there and that his visit was approved at a very high level.
Without the permission of Fidel, I could have never gone into Cuba.
So Fidel Castro gave you permission to enter Cuba?
He gave permission to the authorities so I can go into Cuba and meet with Bob.
And do you think Vesco requested that?
The permission was requested by Bob, yeah, by Vesco.
One of Lader's own pilots has testified that he went to Cuba to arrange drug overflights. Lader will only admit that in Havana he met Robert Vesco and Tony de la Guardia, and that at the end of his stay he left his usual going-away present, a plane.
Now you gave a plane to Cuba.
Right,
Why?
I did. It was suggested by Bob, and I felt that since I was in the airplane business, that was something that I could give, and it is generally what I give away to governments or to people that have been extra kind to me.
By the time Carlos Lader visited Havana, Cuba had been offering facilities to smugglers for almost 4 years. But there is also evidence that Cuba, and even Castro himself, was beginning to play a more active role in the drug trade. The former intelligence officer Manuel de Beunza recalls a meeting with Fidel Castro. He says his own boss, Cuba's intelligence chief, General Jose Abrantes, was there, and that drugs were on the agenda.
I took part in the meeting at which Fidel Castro ordered the creation of companies that were to be involved in drug dealing. There were others there, like Osmani Cienfuegos, Tony La Guardia, Jose Abrantes.
In Panama, Frontline traced 2 of the businesses named by de Beunza. One of them was a shipping firm called Happy Line. The other was a trading concern called Mercurio.
You say that Castro ordered Happy Line be established. Now, how do you know Fidel Castro personally ordered that?
Because I was present. I know Fidel Castro, and I was at the meeting where the company was set up.
You were personally there in the room?
That's right.
What did you hear him say?
Ya yo le expliqué que él no dijo.
I already explained to you that he didn't just say it. He ordered the creation of these companies, Happy Line, Aguamar Shipping Company, and Mercurio, with the specific aim of their getting involved in drug trafficking. Mercurio was the buyer and the negotiator, and Happy Line and Aguamar Shipping, the companies that own ships with Panamanian flags and with Cuban crews with fake Panamanian passports. They traffic in the Caribbean and the south of Cuba, and they also rendezvous with Colombian ships. The merchandise, the cocaine, is handed over and taken to Cuba to the military port of Cienfuegos, Barlovento.
Another former intelligence officer who corroborates this story is Juan Antonio Rodriguez. He'd worked in counterintelligence for over 20 years and used to exchange news with Tony de la Guardia and others in Department MC.
They talk to me because we are friends from way back. Me and Tony de la Guardia go back 30 years. My friendship with Rolando Castañeda goes back 45 years. We all grew up together in the same neighborhood.
Both grow up in the same block, you know? It's not because they are talking with somebody about that. No, it's because I belong to the inside group, a very close group of friends. That's the point. And I talk with them about his business and so on.
Talk about the drug business was a regular part of the lunchtime gossip that Rodriguez shared with Tony de la Guardia at the Centro Vasco restaurant. And this is where he heard about a significant shift in Cuba's drug policy.
They have had 4 years working in drugs, so they know more or less who the producers are, and the distributors, etc., etc. They are convinced that they can get into the market as sellers. So who do they speak to? Abrantes. And he says, well, I will talk to Fidel, and so on. And it is approved by Fidel. So they begin to deal directly, to buy and sell, as well as providing facilities, because they don't cut out the drug dealers. No, what they do is operate where the drug dealers can't. It's like a mafia family. Fidel became a family, but without harming the interests of other families. That's why Carlos Leda was in Cuba. He was there for about 6 months. Carlos Leda was a famous narco trafficker, etc., etc.
Though it's not clear how much business Cuba was doing in its own right, by the mid-'80s, the U.S. Coast Guard was detecting a dramatic increase in drug activity off the Cuban coast.
We would observe in the middle of the day an airdrop going on inside Cuban waters. We were observing from outside in international waters. The scenario would be for a small twin-engine airplane with maybe 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of cocaine fly over Cuba, drop the drugs to a pre-designated rendezvous point to several boats, usually what we call fast boats, high-powered boats that are capable of 40 to 60 knots sometimes. And then it would exit back down off Cuba. And many times it would be under the eyes, or at least a Cuban military vessel would be in the immediate vicinity, right on scene with them.
It became so blatant that drugs were dropped in broad daylight within sight of the Las Americas restaurant, one of Cuba's top tourist attractions. The volume was so high that in a 12-month period, U.S. law enforcement collected intelligence on 54 incidents. From these, a pattern begins to emerge. Cuba's Coast Guard directed most yachts and fast boats to these 6 harbors. The Navy allowed the larger drug ships to dock in 6 bigger ports. The Air Force had responsibility for light planes, which landed at Varadero. Air Force General Rafael Del Pino is the most senior officer to defect from Cuba.
The permission to overfly Cuba have to come from the Ministry of Defense.
The Minister of Defense is Raul Castro, Fidel's brother.
Several times I received order from Raul Castro's office and also from General Abrantes' office to let the airplane cross over Cuba.
Now, what kind of orders did you get?
Well, just tomorrow at 14 Zulu is going to fly an airplane like this, 2 engines, and just let it fly.
The The planes often flew through some of the most restricted airspace in the country.
In the western part of Cuba, we have 19 SAM missile sites, and we have 100 radars, and we have a regiment of MiG-23 interceptor, and it is completely impossible that a smaller plane fly from Colombia to the United States without the knowledge and the permission of the Cuban authority.
According to Del Pino, the military top brass assumed drugs were part of state policy. Officers even argued about the rights and wrongs of it.
Everybody knew there that they were getting in this business. Some of them were against and some were pro. Some say that that was a dirty game, and some of them say, well, in this kind of war against the imperialists, we can use all tricks, and the maximum leader knows the weak part of the United States, and this is a way to make them weaker. In Cuba, more than the other totalitarian country, nothing moved without the knowledge of Fidel Castro.
Nobody can do that or think over, because it's a big problem with Fidel if Fidel don't agree. You understand the point? Nobody take the risk.
Because it's impossible to organize an operation of that size in Cuba without the approval of Fidel Castro.
Despite this, some Navy officers were unhappy with their orders. Manuel de Beunza recalls a revealing conversation with Admiral Betancourt.
Pedro Pérez Betancourt told me that Aldo Santamaria was involved in drug trafficking. He said Aldo was following Fidel and Raúl's orders, but he was doing it reluctantly, whereas he, Pérez Betancourt, said that if he were the boss of the Navy, he would be happy to do it because they were Fidel's orders. And that surprised me.
The drug runners at Marina Hemingway also believed that their Cuban contacts had the approval of their superiors.
If they do it without having the assurance 100%, they're crazy, which I don't think they are. Once Tony and I were alone in the cabin number 26 in the Marina Hemingway down there in Havana, and I asked him, Tony, there is not problem at all in this thing that we're doing, right? I mean, no. You sure? Sure, everything is secure all the way to the top, right? You bet on it.
It's inconceivable to me that a dangerous, risky, criminal activity would have been carried out on the part of Tony de la Guardia, for example, without specific orders from his superiors.
The arrest of Arnaldo Ruiz and his son put Tony on the spot. Their confessions blew his cover. Cuba no longer had deniability. De la Guardia was a spy who was about to be left out in the cold.
He was very lonely, and he was like a fob who didn't know where to go to.
He was cornered.
Yes, he was cornered. He was very cornered.
De la Guardia turned to a former government official to whom he was related by marriage. Jovio Menendez, who now lives in Manhattan, says he received 15 phone calls from Tony de la Guardia in Havana. The last call was only days before his arrest.
The last week of May 1989, he called me and he said that he was involved in drug trafficking, that an order without alternative was given to him by the Minister of Interior at that moment, Jose Abrantes, and it was Fidel who gave the order to Abrantes. Then I was very upset. How can you get involved in a thing like that? I said, it was an order without alternative. I have to do it. And I know that if something happens, I'm going to be alone. If this is known, I'm going to be alone and nobody will protect me.
As he stepped into the witness box at his court-martial, De La Guardia must have felt completely alone. He knew that many of those present had direct knowledge of drug operations. Some had even taken part in them. But no one would speak in De La Guardia's defense.
In the trial itself, remember the tapes that we can see were edited by the Cuban government, totally controlled by the Cuban government. Nevertheless, in one of the tapes, De La Guardia was charged, in fact, with personally, and there's other people personally benefiting from the drug money, denied it. He said he did it because he wanted to earn hard currency for the revolution, that he did not personally benefit from it. The charge of corruption, even though the man's on the spot, even though he's the fall guy, even though he knows he's being set up, is something he personally could not accept and didn't and said so.
Aldo Santamaria. Admiral Santamaria was one of those who signed De La Guardia's sentence, though he himself is still under indictment for drug trafficking in the U.S.
Sergio del Valle. Tony La Guardia knew that Fidel was involved in drug trafficking. He was the only living witness, except perhaps Raúl Castro and Abrantes, who knew that Fidel was involved in drug trafficking. Fidel had to get rid of him.
After the court-martial and the trial, Castro convened the Council of State in order to ratify the sentences. Under Cuban law, the maximum sentence for drug smuggling is 15 years. But De La Guardia, General Ochoa, and their two aides were facing death. For 2 spellbinding hours, Castro argued that the moral damage done to the revolution amounted to high treason, and death was the only proper punishment.
Fidel dice, yo represento la revolución. La revolución.
Fidel says, I represent the revolution. It's an ideology of purity and morality. His power rests on this ideology, and this keeps him from being just another dictator. Otherwise, Fidel would be just like Somoza, just like Trujillo, just like the others. So for this reason, Fidel needs to maintain the ideology because it keeps him in power.
In the end, when it came to the vote, Castro urged the council to raise their hands and ratify the death sentences.
Los que estén de acuerdo con la ratificación de la pena establecida por el Tribunal Militar, que levanten la mano.
Castro was unopposed.
He is willing to jettison his closest friends, who's safe in Cuba, because they may be set up at some point if it's convenient to use another fall guy. And I think that has very serious implications for the regime and himself.
Se ratifica.
4 days after Castro closed the session, De La Guardia and 3 others faced the firing squad.
Ha concluido la sesión.
I felt very angry, and I felt that Fidel had been merciless. He has protected his image by killing a man who was acting under his orders.
According to Castro, the destruction of De La Guardia's ring should have stopped the flow of drugs through Cuba. According to U.S. Customs, trafficking has declined since the trial, but it has not stopped. According to the drug smugglers, De La Guardia was not the only official who helped channel drugs through Cuba.
Is that the end of drug smuggling in Cuba?
No.
How do you know?
Because those channels are available anytime, and I could activate 1 or 2 very easily, or send to activate it.
How many do you know of?
How many do I know? 5 or 6.
5 or 6 people?
Channels.
The 5 top Cuban officials named by Ruiz include Admiral Santamaria and Manuel Pinheiro, head of the America Department. The U.S. Coast Guard has also continued to observe drug drops off Cuba in the last 18 months.
We detected airplanes flying over Cuba and apparently making airdrops of drugs for 3 nights in a row. One night in particular, they dropped to 3 U.S. fast boats right inside Cuban waters. We intercepted them in international waters.
088 at 1/2 mile. 088 at 1/2 mile.
We chased them. They headed back down into Cuban waters.
258 at 22 knots. Your target is heading 258 at 22 knots. 110 foot. Okay, target's going hard right.
We also encountered several Cuban gunboats during the same chase.
As in the past, those gunboats appeared to be protecting the operation. And when the Americans got too close, a Cuban helicopter came to chase them away. At least 18 such operations have been observed by U.S. Customs since the trial. There is no way of knowing how many others have gone undetected.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.